Hello, G-Bros, and today we're going to be talking about Hegel's Justification of Hegel, Part 3, Sections 9 through 13. And we've spoken before how we exist with a feeling of abstract freedom, which is a notion that we should not have to face determinations, which can lead us to be pathological unless we can learn to live with those determinations and choose them as necessary for freedom. And that would be the choice of determinations to become necessities, is the language I use, as in necessary for freedom and necessary for us to confront and decide how we're going to live with them. And the role of the state, a big role of the state, is to help us come to terms with that determination. If we want to use Lacan's language, we could say that we come into existence feeling a lack. You could also say we come feeling like we should return to the womb in Freud, and we really have to come to the place where we overcome that temptation. This section also touches on, Hegel will talk about semblance. He says in the Elements, the semblance is therefore the untruth which disappears because it seeks to exist for itself, and in this disappearance, essence has sown itself as essence, that is, as the power over semblance. And semblance you can get connected with wrongness, and what's very tricky is that wrongness always presents itself as right when you encounter it. Otherwise, you wouldn't really have to worry about it, right? Like, you wouldn't even really have to call it wrongness if it presented itself to you as wrong. And that's precisely the trouble. This is why we need a process through time and history of testing to figure out what notions of rightness are actually only semblances and ergo wrong, as opposed to what semblances of rightness are actually rightness and ergo always rightness. And that's kind of the tricky move. If I look at a piece of paper and see 2 + 2 = 5, then I go, that's wrong. But that's not really wrongness in the sense because I experience myself as right to see that as wrong. It's impossible for me to grasp something and not experience that grasping as right. This is talked about also in the phenomenology of true ignorance. And so this poses a problem because even when I'm encountering wrongness, I naturally experience it as a semblance. Well, not even as a semblance, really, but as a rightness. And only later, when it's unveiled as a wrongness, do I know that I was grasping a semblance. But this means I'm kind of posed to make some very serious mistakes. Well, the more we move from the individual to the state, or the collective consciousness, or the collective, the more likely it is that we will gradually realize rightness from wrongness, actual rightness, the essence of rightness from semblances of rightness, and that we can absorb that rightness into our thinking, into our system, and into our development. So this is another reason why so there's a few moves here. If we are naturally experiencing the world in terms of rightness, because we phenomenologically gravitate toward rightness, and the more we're dealing with a collective consciousness, the higher the likelihood we encounter rightness. This is all the more reason to assume that the state of things is more right than wrong, ergo for us to assume that we should think the now. And it is quite critical, like, if I make 100 mistakes and then I come upon a single correct position, I then can hold to that correct position forever and assume it moving forward. And so you can have where discovery of rightness can build upon one another, and you can keep going from there. Also, too, a reason why it's almost better to side with the collective. You're justified to assume the collective is going to be more right than wrong is because, like, if you're sitting in a classroom, and I remember this example from a class one online, maybe at Princeton or something, political science, the guy was talking about Hegel, and he made the point, like, you have this board and it's all in Mandarin Chinese. No one, if one person in that class knows Mandarin, then everyone in the class can know what the sign says, right? But the probability that a given person knows Mandarin is quite low, right? But the fact that the probability of a collective knowing it is higher, and the greater the collective, the higher the likelihood there's at least one person that knows Mandarin, and therefore everyone can know what the board says. And if everyone knows what the board said, then practically it's the same as everyone knowing Mandarin, and that's the trick, right? As you move to a collective, it becomes more probable that you're more right than wrong, and if one person is right, it can spread to the collective. If one person invents electricity, then it can spread and everyone can gain electricity. If one person comes up with a new idea that's very useful, then everyone can benefit from that idea and things can spread. And so given this justification of the state and reason to think that it's more right than wrong, once Hegel makes the move of making us realize that we need to will determinations in order to be free, he can then make the case basically that the determinations presented to us by the state are those of which we could accept. Because, you could argue which determinations you should accept, which ones should you not accept. Well, if they're presented by the state of things, the now, then these are the ones you should think. And that could be in terms of family, property, community, and so on and so forth. We shouldn't will the determinations of 1820 or will the determinations of the future where we have some sort of cybernetic implant or something, even if that day arises. If that day arises, then we can think it then. But really, we should will the determinations of now, of which are presented by the state. And that's because there's more reason for the state to be correct or not. And in this, I think you could also say there's a movement for us if we individually will or want to do something, we may want to check it over and to see if other people agree with it or other people think it's worth doing. That might be a useful way to check and balance ourselves, because it's more likely that the collective might have insight that we ourselves are blinded from because we're confusing a semblance with rightness. Now, you have to be careful with that, though, because the collective can also be the mass of which falls into the banality of evil, and therefore they're thoughtless. But there is something interesting here where you may, as the individual, want to submit yourself to the crucible and check and balance of the collective. And if you come through that and they're all telling you you're wrong, but you've experienced that and you say, no, I'm still going to do my own thing. Well, now you've at least earned that standing that you have for yourself. You've earned that individual position, even if the collective is against that. And that, I think, would also kind of bring to mind some of David Hume's philosophical journey. But anyway, the point is that Hegel is going to make the move by which we should choose the determinations of the state, that there is reason to do that, and thus turn them into necessities which are necessary for freedom. Now, also in the elements of the philosophy of right, Hegel is going to talk about morality and ethics. Morality is more individual, ethics is more social and collective. And the point of the paper is to say that today, it's probably the case that ethics and morality are more necessary than ever before, which is ironic because today they seem to be in decline with religion and all that, although one would have to caveat that claim and elaborate on it. But in the past, it was easier to say unify a nation or a people with an outside problem or an outside enemy, and that could get you into Rene Girard or Carl Schmitt or different things. But today, if we have nukes and World War III would destroy us all, we really cannot unify ourselves as readily with an outside threat or an outside enemy. We have to find grounds for unity internally between ourselves. This is very difficult because then we have to learn to live with difference, like literally live with difference, as opposed to distract ourselves from difference with an outside enemy. And a lot of the task of philosophy today is to in fact help us to learn to live with difference, which is to live with ourselves as a subject, as opposed to find unity on grounds of a shared enemy or a shared problem. This is also going to then point to the issue of where I think Hegel, it would have been very interesting had Hegel written after the nuclear bomb was invented. And I've mentioned this in a few conversations. In Hegel, progress, the future is progressive, like history is progressive, but there's no guarantee we have a future, and that's especially the case now after nukes. Hegel's entire theory of history, I would be curious if it was the same, because in Hegel's day, even if there was a massive war, it wasn't like the war of, say, the 7 Years' War, violence of this nature. It's not like that was going to wipe out the entire planet, right? So you would assume that humanity would advance beyond the war and learn from it. So there's a good reason to think that history is progressive. But today, where we can literally destroy ourselves, or we're capable in complexity theory, complexity science, to create very fragile global networks that if they failed, it could tear down the entire business sector. The business, global economy, maybe send us back 20 years, right? So these things may have changed Hegel's language. I'm not saying the theory, he would have changed the notion that the future is better than the past. But there may have been more emphasis on the contingency of the future. I think there is contingency in Hegel, constant contingency, lots of contingency. But the emphasis in regard to the future may have been a little more on that contingency. I'm not sure. I'd have to theorize about that. But anyway, today ethics is more critical, learning to live with one another, how to carry out those practices. And when Hegel discusses Antigone, There's also some reason to think that ethics requires some sort of transcendental grounding, which of course is problematic if religion is in decline. But this is where the justification of the state is really important, because if the state is justified, then what the state emerges to that seems right or ethical, we would have reason to assume is probably right and not arbitrary. Because this is the problem with ethics, right? Like ethics compels action. And when ethics is compelling you to do something you don't want to do, why should you do it? Well, if you believe in God, it's because God said so. And you go, okay, it has authority. So where does ethics get its authority? Well, if Hegel can make it the state, and there's reason to assume that the state is justified, then we can assume that following the ethical action will increase the probability that we are more right than wrong. And if right brings out the fullness of humanity, or brings out things that enable us or prove better, then there would be reason to follow that. I mean, there's also just simply the part that, if you had to worry about your neighbors burning down your house and not facing prosecution, or if you had to worry about being killed every time you went outside, society would not function. And so there's reason to assume the ethical, or the authority of the ethical, precisely so that you can live in a functioning society and do what you want to do. Well, but all that, of course, is provided by the state, and thus there's reason to assume the state and to think according to the state. I think all this also suggests maybe Robert Brandam's work on a spirit of trust and the social and communal dimensions of Hegel's thinking. I think that Dr. Brandam is really focused on the phenomenology of spirit, but I think we can see here some of the overlays in a philosophy of right. Anyway, I would say, if I were to list out 4 points that Hegel has defended in his work so far, he's defended and provided reason to think that the state is reliable and justified, that therefore philosophy is reliable and justified, therefore the phenomenological journey is reliable and justified, to allude to Gödel last, and that the effort for absolute knowing is reliable and justified. There is reason to think that these enterprises are not a waste of time or keeping us from rightness. And that's a big deal, because if you cannot assume then it's going to be very hard to not enter into deconstructive nihilism, because you could always wonder if you're wasting your time, or wonder if the current moment is what you should assume and think. And so you wouldn't be able to progress, and society would probably just fracture and fracture and fracture. And so this would also justify the effort to develop a subject of which is capable of the science of logic, and that's very important in Hegel. Now, another thing that I find interesting is very often people will talk about Hegel as if he describes Geist, the state, as the world becoming a global nation state, a single people, a single nation, so on and so forth. I think it's important. I would argue that in Hegel there is indeed growing interconnectability. Increasingly more people are under the same umbrella, they can relate. But that's not to say that history is a story of increasing unity, in the sense that everyone becomes one, thinks the same way, operates the same way, identifies with the same nation state. For Hegel, there's growing interconnectability, but that's not necessarily the same as unity. And you could say that in Hegel, basically, if we don't figure out how to harmonize the difference never goes away. It's increasingly brought in proximity, which means there's going to be a lot of tension, a lot of pathological difficulty, a lot of anxiety. And if we don't learn to harmonize with difference, then there's probably going to be trouble. Dr. Philip Nicholas, who I adore, he pointed out that a family is always a collection of difference, and so the implicit logic of gathering difference is present from the very first act of reproduction. And that's exactly right. So the family is different. Now, arguably, it's a more tolerable level of difference, because even if there's, difference of interest and so on and so forth, there's like a shared bloodline, at least. And if 2 people got married together, there's a higher chance that they have shared interests or whatever. Not necessarily, of course. And what you think is similarity ends up not being similar at all. But the point is that the family is a collection of difference. And what we have to see in Hegel is the globe becoming more and more like a quote-unquote family. Now, the problem with the language of family is people hear that and they hear unity, getting along, love, and stuff like that. Well, not necessarily. You could end up in No Exit by Sartre, where you're forced to be together and yet you can't get along because hell is other people, as Sartre tells us. So this is very, very contingent. There is a kind of growing unity in Hegel, but it's not a unity that erases difference, and we also have to be very careful to conflate unity and better. It's possible that everyone being under the same umbrella makes things worse and more difficult because we can't handle the anxiety. And here we can see again why there should be an emphasis on the development of the subject and the preparing the subject to deal with difference, as opposed to thinking the future. And so philosophy should really be in the business of working on the subject, because if we're increasingly globalized, interconnected, and things like that, and we can't handle it, there could be trouble. And I think we're seeing that today. Like, if the world is truly bifurcating between, Eurasia and America and Russia, China, and all that, we could be, the threat of nuclear war is going through the roof, and the threat of economic collapse is going through the roof. So we may have already failed what Hegel is warning we need to prepare for. It already may be too late. Now, I'm not a determinist. I'm not going to say it is too late. But basically, what's happening now suggests that we failed to use philosophy to prepare the subject in a manner that would make us be able to handle increasing encounter with difference. And as a result, we're splintering off again in a world where splintering off can have very dire consequences. So I think we really need to see, when Hegel talks about Geist and unity and the nation coming together, it is not an erasing of difference. It is a bringing together of difference under the same umbrella, which poses a whole lot of challenges. And you could argue that our failure to meet those challenges is a reason why you have the mental health crisis today, what some people have called the meaning crisis, meta crisis, all of this different language. And of course, this is extremely bad because we have nuclear weapons. We're all under the same umbrella, and we have the ability to blow one another up. It's very dire. Now, I think another thing that has to be touched on in Hegel is a lot of people argue that in Hegel there's a growing rationality where humanity becomes more rational through time, and he's read into an Enlightenment structure, of which then would contribute to why he's read as supporting a global nation state where everyone's under the same umbrella, so on and so on. There is a kind of growing rationality, yes, but it does not follow that Hegel supported autonomous rationality, which is rationality that does not attribute to a non-rational foundation. The growing rationality in Hegel it comes as a consequence of a growing rightness of the state. The state is non-rational. It is through trial and error, all these different things through history, and rationality becomes more rational because it is organized increasingly by that non-rationality, of which, is arguably closer to the quote-unquote absolute or realizing the absolute in Hegel. The collective arguably comes closer to something like absolute knowing, and therefore rationality will become more aligned with absolute knowing. If history is a progress of an increasing realization of the need collectively for the phenomenological journey, well, then that would be a collective realization of the new kind of subject of the absolute knower, ergo the emergence of communities of absolute knowing, Nietzschean children, all these different terms, and that gets us into belonging again. And indeed, Hegel proposes a notion of a kind of growing rationality because there's a growing rightness due to the development of the state through history to be attracted more so to rightness than wrongness, just because of how it unfolds and the intersuppositional development that occurs when spirit, state, collective encounters determinations that it is thrown into and has to figure out how to live with those determinations. Hegel tells us that right is something utterly sacred for the simple reason that it is the existence of the absolute concept of self-conscious freedom. So the more the state becomes right through time, that means the more we engage in sacredness, and ultimately sacredness is alignment with absolute knowing. Now, I'm not saying God for Hegel is absolute knowing. That's a different matter. But absolute knowing is a sacred state of realizing the essentialness of limitation, and our ability also to choose the meaning of that limitation, which is, of course, the absolute choice. And through history, there's more and more of an awareness of the need to make the absolute choice. And so there is a kind of growing rationality. The key, though, is this is not autonomous rationality, which is the dire mistake. We do not see in Hegel some sort of, humans are more rational in a kind of calculative Enlightenment rationality that makes science supreme, right? There's a way to say, in Hegel, society becomes more scientific. That's what people can read into it. That's not the case at all. And it's dangerous to go that route because autonomous rationality eats itself, as we learn in Hume. So, although there's a kind of growing rationality, the growth of this rationality is due to an increasing awareness of the state to define rightness in terms of absolute knowing collectively, which is accepting a limitation and choosing the meaning of this limitation, which is not a scientific choice. It's not a purely rational choice. It's a non-rational choice. So we become more rational in the sense as we come to realize more so the impossibility of autonomous rationality. Now, it's not guaranteed, though, but here's the key. It's not guaranteed that we do continue to realize that. We may actually become more autonomously rational and eat ourselves. So this is all contingent. But if there is a future, that future will be one in which we more so realize the impossibility of autonomous rationality than not. One in which we realize the true isn't the rational more so than not. And define and become more absolute knowers and define being educated and a philosophical being and an intelligent being as someone who's not purely skillful in rationality, but someone who's skillful in the entire gambit of ways by which the subject carries itself in the world. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, YouTube, Twitter, Anchor. You can find the other sections of this paper on Medium and some of the other audio summaries on YouTube. And thank you so much for your time.